I can see myself in this. Maybe not even in the way that the original creators intended or could have ever imagined. If art gets people excited, I think that's a win.
What's the password?
Let me in, you idiot.
Right you are.
Something I've thought a lot about in game design, for example, between horror and action. In action, I find that you're going to be either matched up with opponents who are less powerful than you or equal, so that it's kind of a heightened. It's more of a thrilling, like power fantasy kind of thing. Whereas in horror games, I find that characters are very often super underpowered, and that's part of why it gets super scary. And I'm totally new to horror TTRPGs, but how do you go about designing encounters in a horror space? Do you have to make monsters that are really overwhelming? Do you get that through creature design? Do you get that through mechanics? And how do you achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There's any number of approaches that you can take to encounter design in a game, whether it's a video game or a tabletop game. But I would say with horror, there are definitely a few approaches. I mean, one is one that you see in more like old school tabletop game designs, which is, monsters are scary. And they should be terrifying on a mechanical level, in that, you get hit once by this thing, you're dead, or you get hit once and you have been poisoned or cursed or what, various things that give you a kind of like immediate impact. One thing that Mothership, one of the game systems that I've made stuff for, does is like if you're a player and you're trying to attack something or whatever, you have to roll to see if you do it, but monsters just hit you. And part of the rationale behind that is, if you think about any kind of horror movie or whatever, if monsters are missing you all the time, if there's some like horrible creature who's like trying to hit you and they should be able to, but they just, roll bad, it's not a horror movie anymore, right? It's comedy. And so on a mechanical level, there's a lot of things that you can do to make it so that as a player, you're trying more than anything else to just avoid the encounter altogether. And if you're getting players to do that, then they're afraid of the encounter, right? And so you've created a situation which has a horror feel to it. I'd say at a tabletop scenario where you're just sitting around a table with your friends, horror is pretty challenging to achieve, right? Because it's a safe environment, right? You're with your friends, you're hanging around, you're eating chips and, whatever. And you can create these scenarios where your friends are like, screaming at the table because they're thrilled about what's happening or they're freaked out or whatever. But there's always so scary that you can really get by doing that. And people get scared for their characters, worried that their characters will die or whatever. But when it comes to being more unsettling, freaking people out, that's where you kind of get to like campfire stories, and thinking about like you get away from mechanical fear, right? Of, I'm afraid that my character is going to go down to 0 hit points and, I'm going to lose my character. Like that has an effect, but you start having to tap into real psychological fears and getting people, I would say, more unsettled than horrified. And that's much more achievable in a kind of tabletop setting. Is like, if you think about, sitting around a campfire and telling stories, like, you're definitely, the ambience helps you a lot, right? You're in the woods, it's dark all around you, there's strange sounds out there that you don't know what they are, and you're just around a campfire and you can feel the warmth and see the light, and everything beyond that, you're filling with your imagination. And so the storyteller is feeding you things that are preying on certain fears or insecurities or whatever. And you're filling the space that is literally behind you with those fears, right? And so that's why campfire stories can be so scary. At a table in someone's house, again, you don't have all of that to work with, but what you do have are those like fears and insecurities. And so when I work on a like horror setting or something like that, I tend to start with some core idea that is scary to me, right? Or that I know is scary to people. But generally, if it's scary to you as the author, by feeling it yourself, you're much more able to kind of communicate that to others.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, gosh, it's such a funny thing. Every time I ask a question, there's so many things I want to touch on and be like, oh man, that was sick. But then just by the nature of the interview, you have to ask the next question. So I don't want to dawdle too much, but, one of the interesting things I think about Blades of Gixa, your, Dungeon 23 mega dungeon project was, the idea of, making lore and everything as you go. And there are many pieces of that I imagine we could talk about here, but once you start that part of your brain of thinking, how is an environment informed by history and all that kinds of things, like, are you able to shut that off? Do you find that coming up in your daily life, like walking around, seeing buildings and thinking about the history of the area and that kind of thing?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think when I'm creating a setting for something like Gixa, it's not just like, okay, this is an adventure, this is a little scenario for you to get into. It's a lot larger than that, right? It's something that is an entire world, in theory, or it should at least imply a world, because the nature of what players will be exploring and everything is supposed to tie into and have connections to everything around them, right? So you have like characters who basically they just need a context of some kind, right? And so when I'm out and about in the world, I mean, I'm always wondering, not necessarily always thinking about my projects, right? Like with Gixa, but certainly you have to wonder, like, what was this neighborhood that I live in 50 years ago, 100 years ago? And like one thing I always think about is like, I've lived in a bunch of places that used to have a lot more public transit infrastructure than they do now. And like the town I grew up in used to have streetcars. And in fact, I think the street I grew up on had or once had streetcar tracks on it, which, if you're familiar with the history, at some point, like General Motors and all these car companies basically bought up all the streetcars, tore them all up, and basically pushed everyone into owning cars. And it's fascinating that we as someone who lives in the United States, like I used to live in a place, and actually where I live now, the neighborhood I live in now, also I just found out pretty recently that there used to be a streetcar that went through this neighborhood as well, and that got torn up at some point. And the things like public transit really shape the way you experience a city or a neighborhood or whatever. And so by creating something like that, by creating a streetcar or train or a bus line, like, you're really changing the shape of the space for the people that exist there. And when you tear it down, you're changing the shape of the space for the people that exist there. And I feel like, I don't know why I got off on streetcars all of a sudden, but I guess it's just that I found this out recently, that there was this streetcar here, and it's like, man, it would be so convenient if that was still there. And um and so I'm fascinated by the history of these things, and like how they like what are the forces at play that built that initially and then tore it down later, and why is the world I live in, the world that we live in, shaped the way it is, right? There's like any number of historical forces that are at the root of that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You may or may not know this. Depending on how much my stuff you watch, but my degree is in urban planning, so there's a tremendous deal I could say on that. But yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to put a finer point on it than that. But yeah, that is something I find myself thinking about quite often. Just the fact that I don't know. I think the thing I come back to a lot is a lot of things just move and people don't know why they're moving, and sometimes like when cars were the big new thing, everyone wanted to ditch all the old stuff. But I think any sort of like, whether it be your own life or society or transportation or anything, I think there needs to be a lot more thoughtful consideration about what we have currently, what is working and what is not working, and what new things we should bring into that, rather than just being servants of technology, I think. But that is a separate conversation, I imagine. One of the things that I heard you say in your interview with Sean McCoy, I believe, the creator of Mothership, and I thought this was such an interesting quote. You said, I think most kindness stems from simple curiosity. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you meant by that.
Yeah. I guess sort of the most basic kindness that you can extend to someone is just to be curious about them. And if you were to flip that, if you were to take the inverse, like being incurious about someone is pretty unkind, right? Like it is kind of a such a simple act to look at someone and wonder about them. And it really opens you up to like, who is this person? Who could they be? What's their story? Right. And the flip side of that, which, I think we all see all too often, is you look at someone and you decide who they are on their behalf, right? Without talking to them, without really interacting with them. And so, yeah, I think the act of being kind to someone, if you're being more active about it, like the act of being kind to someone involves taking their needs into account, right? Considering what they might want. And usually the way to find out what they want, is to ask them what they want, right? And so I think, when it comes to games and like when I'm running a game for people at a table, one of the things that I've found is different players come to the table with different interests, desires, expectations. And as the person who's running a game, as a DM or referee or whatever your system calls it, you're a participant as well, right? You have to take yourself into consideration. What do you like? What is going to keep you interested? But at the same time, you can't really, you're not going to have a good time if you're railroading other people with what you want, without thinking about, well, this person is really into the nitty gritty, game mechanics. They like hitting things with swords and being strategic and blah, blah, blah. And they're not comfortable with role play or what have you. And then this other person could not give two shits about hitting things with swords, but they loved um, figuring out who their character is and how that character fits in with these other characters in this world, right? And as a social space, it's kind of your job as the person running it to find ways to understand all of the people at the table and help them experience the thing that they are excited about, and also, maybe expose them to things that they don't know that they could be excited about and see if they bite, right? So I don't know if that really answers your question, but
No, you're all good. You're on such a roll. It's hard to tell when the wisdom's stopping. But, you know, well, again, I have so many things to say on all of this, but I don't want to just make this all about my responses.
no, I'd love to hear.
Well,
love to hear what you think.
It's an interesting thing. I think, there's so many pieces there. It's hard to grasp onto one. But I guess the place I'll start. One of the most influential works of fiction, certainly in my life, is the soccer anime Blue Lock, and the manga and everything. I have a Blue Lock painting, which is like, it's sick as hell. I just moved in, so I haven't put it up. My background looks really weird, but it doesn't matter. Anyways, one of the really important concepts in Blue Lock, especially the manga, this part of it hasn't been animated yet, is the idea of protagonist feeling. The thing that everyone needs to feel like the main character of their own story. And that was like a huge, like, the heavens parting and like the wisdom being shot into my brain moment where I was like, oh yeah, and it, yeah, I don't know. So this is I think a lot of people in different professions or hobbies or whatever end up with that sort of knowledge. They just arrive at it differently, and I don't know. I think it's so interesting. I think it's, and I guess it gets back to what you were talking about earlier. I can't remember the question that prompted you to, I think, to mention that, but to mention what I'm going to touch on. But I think human life and all of these things are just worth a certain amount of trouble and a certain amount of respect. And I think one of the, to my mind, perhaps the biggest philosophical challenge of our time is the idea that I think the world is suggesting that human beings are really just exist as engines of profit, and I fundamentally disagree with that, and I think a lot of people do. It's just that to do so is to kind of cut against the modern world in a certain way, but so yeah, I don't know. That's kind of what I jumped to, but it is very interesting to listen to, certainly. I don't ask people about inspirations because I find it's a little bit hacky, but what I have done is I've thought of a couple things that I get the impression might be inspirations, and I'd love to bounce them off you. If they're not your thing, it's totally cool, no problem at all. But
Sure.
starting off, the first one, maybe a little bit of an obvious one, is Dark Souls an inspiration on you?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree. I've actually honestly only played the first game in the series, but it definitely left an impression. I will say that. Dark Souls definitely has such an atmosphere, and it accomplishes it in such kind of weird ways. I mean, it obviously has very evocative character designs and environmental designs and all of that, but also, like, there are characters that you talk to, NPCs, who basically just say gibberish, and they're kind of like laughing to themselves quietly, and they say things that don't make any sense. And like, even once you've played the game a lot and read a lot of the lore that is attached to, items in the game and everything, like, you go back to that character and you're like, I still don't know what the hell you're talking about. But it all kind of contributes to a certain atmosphere. And I think of Dark Souls as kind of a horror game, or sort of horror adjacent. in that it is, all of those things, like the characters that don't really make sense, and the monstrous creatures and all the things in the world, they all kind of add up to this kind of nightmarish feeling that you're exploring this space and you're trying to talk to people and you can't really understand them, and you're facing off against these creatures that seem so totally insurmountable. And like it's interesting because it does give you that sense of accomplishment, right? After you've fought the same boss 20 times and you finally beat it. But at the same time, I don't know, it as a game, it just has so much like dread in it. And sort of strange logic that doesn't strictly make sense, but once you've been playing the game for a while, you sort of internalize it. And it starts to make sense to you, or it starts to seem like, well, yeah, the giant crow picks you up and drops you in its nest, and that's how you get there. Like that's fine. And yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from that, as a game designer, in that you can say less and get more across, depending on how you say it, which is probably rich coming from me, like a person who, completely covers pages with words and illustrations and stuff. But I do think that in some ways Gixa is a weird project for me, and my previous project, Work to Beyond Recognition, is a little more what I would do if I was planning a project, which is a lot more streamlined and a lot more kind of cutting out craft and honing down to something that is a little more specific, a little more direct.
You perhaps inadvertently touched on the next one I was going to ask about. Spelled differently, but Judge Dredd, is that an influence on you at all?
Not too much. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with Judge Dredd, the old comics, and was it Stallone in the movie? This is not an amazing movie, but it certainly has its charms. But yeah, some of the old, from like the sort of 2000 AD, like UK comics world, I'm certainly familiar with some of that stuff, and the sort of like Thatcher Reagan era kind of counterculture, which is also what stuff like Warhammer kind of grew out of. Definitely a lot of that stuff is an influence. I wouldn't say Dread specifically, but certainly a lot of the creative space surrounding it. Yeah.
And then last one here, and I can never remember the official title of the game, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about. Was the Obra Dinn an influence at all?
Interesting. Well, I mean, considering the visuals you're seeing right now, I can see where that's coming from. I did play Obra Dinn. I did like it a lot. I wouldn't say that it honestly was a huge inspiration on projects that I've done, though. Because yeah, a lot of stuff that I've done kind of in this vein, like the visuals you're seeing now, and the blog that I have, Trash, which has all these like very stark black and white visuals. I started that before ever playing Obra Dinn. It had that visual style, and I think that much more came out of, to some extent, just wanting to have a distinct look, but also because I was playing Mothership, and a lot of the stuff on that blog is about Mothership. And Mothership started off as a zine, and has this very kind of stark, it's all black and white, right? It's a very kind of simple, stark sort of look. And um and the other thing is I found that I was doing a lot of photo collage for that blog. And so I was just finding random photos on the internet and kind of cutting them together and then crushing them down to like this 1-bit image that is, just black and white. And it is much easier to do like seamless photo collage if you're only working in black and white. You can really just blow out a lot of detail and act like, yeah, this image flows right into this image. It's totally fine.
This is, I guess, we'll see, we'll see how this question goes. It might totally bomb, but what can you tell me about the art to xenoesotericism pipeline?
Art to xenoesotericism. Well, it's let's see. I would say so there's a skill in Mothership called xenoesotericism, which is one of the like default skills in the game that characters can have. And it's the one that players always ask about, because it's a word that no one's ever seen before. And so xenoesotericism, as it's conceived of in the game, is it's sort of the intersection between religion and aliens. And it's sort of, so something interesting about the RPG Mothership is it doesn't have a specific setting, right? If you look at other RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, it has a sort of default setting, the Forgotten Realms, which has, if you played like Baldur's Gate, you've explored that setting, right? And Mothership doesn't have that, right? Mothership has kind of cultural touchstones, and it has things that could imply a setting, but it doesn't have like an official setting into itself. Also, is this noise picking up?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I was like, I thought I heard something, but I think the noise cancellation got it. You're all good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the neighbors are working on something. So yeah, so like
the unique setting and the
yeah. So the setting of Mothership is like has a lot of cultural touchdowns. It's certainly drawn on Aliens and or the Alien movies rather, Blade Runner, the like to a lesser extent, other sci-fi out there, your Predator, your whatever. But it's really, I feel like those two are really the big ones. It's like Alien and Blade Runner, and the sort of like sort of quotidian space trucker horror of Alien, plus the sort of cyberpunk corporate horror of Blade Runner. And yeah, so you like you kind of have those settings, or you have this like implied setting, and when it comes to like when you have something in a setting like or in a system like this skill xenoesotericism, and you don't really explain it beyond like it's about aliens and esotericism, what you wind up with is people having to sort of interpolate like what that could possibly mean, or extrapolate what that could possibly mean. And I think what it implies, at least what it's implied in my games, has always been like there's some interaction that people have in this world with aliens, whether that be alien creatures or sort of unknowable alien entities or whatever. And humans have a need to explain everything and categorize everything, and religion and esotericism is one of the ways that we do that. And I think while it's an impulse and sort of an obvious one to look at a sci-fi setting and think, what is it? It's science fiction, right? So when we're looking at aliens, like, we should have some clean boxes to put them in. We know that this alien is motivated by this and does this and wants this, but it's also a horror setting. And so having some ineffability, having some unknowability really deepens what an alien could be, and lets that alien or that foreign entity kind of live in your head and grow past what the person running the game, might even consider, right? And so as the player, as the person running the game, as the warden, like, my goal is to, like, infect you with this creature and get it to live in your head. And so when it comes to art, I think a lot of what we do as artists is we, to some extent, are making sense of the world, or we're making. I don't love, like, thinking about art as simple, like, self-expression. I think it's that feels a bit solipsistic. I think it's much more of a way of exploring connections and interactions. And certainly you as an artist are one point in that web of interactions. But I think as an artist, like, you are kind of reaching out from that point through all these nodes and through all these edges and connections, to things that you have greater or lesser understandings of, right? And so as you're expanding your purview and incorporating things into your art and kind of gluing them together and tearing them apart and turning this into some form of expression, you're taking things that are in this space and kind of asking yourself, like, what do I make of this? And yeah, I think that, like, there is something very esoteric to that always, right? Because you can kind of kid yourself and think, oh, this is somehow measurable, this is somehow explicable, whatever. But there's no particular reason that anything in the world, or that everything in the world, should be able to, like, fit in to our conception of the world. There's no reason that everything in this whole universe should be able to, like, be something that the meat between my ears can model, right? Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, but I feel like that's a, like, sort of the alien and the esoteric, really kind of can infuse everything and can really be, like, what art is about, if you want to look at it that way.
Gosh, I need to be taking extra strength Mucinex, I tell you what. But one of my first interview projects, it didn't end up going anywhere, but I was interviewing modders from Fallout New Vegas because I just thought it was really interesting. And one of the people I talked to was a modder named, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Astera. And something he said was that, well, I'll quote him. He said, if there's anything at all that I don't like about the experience, playing Fallout New Vegas, I can almost always fix it. That's what he said. And it's interesting, you have your house rules for Mothership, and you have your own modules and all these things. Do you relate at all to that inclination?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's a big part of the tradition of RPGs in general, that people create house rules. And like, it's kind of inevitable, because when you're playing a video game, for instance, I don't think it's necessarily inevitable, right? Because you're playing a game, the game is programmed to work a certain way, and you have your style of play, you have your way of playing that game. But unless you dig into becoming a modder, you're not really altering the fundamentals of how the game works. And with stuff like tabletop games, it's all living in your head, right? And it's all living in your players' heads. And there's a saying in sort of the board game design world that your game can only be as smart as the dumbest person at the table, right? And what that means is your game is on paper, it's in a book, whatever, the rules are there, the components are in the box. But in order to actually play the game, you need to internalize how the game works. You need to have an understanding of the game. And so does everyone else at the table, if they want to be able to actually play it, if they want to be able to actually strategize about it, if they want to be able to enjoy it, right? They need to have some understanding of, okay, if I move my piece here, this is going to happen. Or at the beginning of my turn, I draw a card and I do what it says, or whatever. Like, they need to understand that that's how it works. And I forgot where I was going with this, actually. I was kind of rambling.
No, you're all good. I think it's just the idea. It sounded like you were touching on the ideas of like getting the rules of the game to kind of mesh with like the way your brain interprets the game. Is that kind of where you were going?
Yeah. I mean, it's really largely about like your understanding of the game determines how you can. Oh, I remember. Okay, your understanding of the game like exists in your head, and you, as a result, like, if you want to change how a video game works, right? And I've worked on video games. It's kind of a pain to do. Like, if you're a modder, if you're whatever, like, how these things work, you can certainly do it. But you're going to have to like close the game, open up your code editor, change some stuff, try some things out, close it, compile it, run the game, see if it works. Oh, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work quite the way you wanted. Okay, close the game, do it all over again, right? And there's this whole like iteration loop that just goes on and on and on. And if you're on a table with people, you can just say, hey, what if it works this way? And all of a sudden, it works that way, right? Like, that's all it takes. And so you can change stuff so easily, so quickly. And that can be dangerous because you can wind up in like full on Calvin ball territory where you're just, changing rules willy-nilly and nothing means anything. But if you are, let's say you're playing an RPG and you're running a campaign with people, like I've done with Mothership, you play just the base game, rules as written, for a while. And then you start to run up against something. It's like, oh, the rules as written, they don't really support this thing that I want to do, or I want to have like my players keep on doing stuff with the spaceship, and the rules don't really handle that scenario very elegantly. Could I come up with something that I could just slot in there and deal with that scenario, right? And I think that just happens with role-playing games all the time. Like even with, big mainstream systems like D&D, you go to any table and people are like, oh yeah, we don't care about components for spell casting, or like, oh yeah, we don't care about inventory space, or we don't use this kind of, like, that's everywhere. And so I think it's one of the beauties of tabletop games and tabletop RPGs is you don't need to be technically very proficient to be able to tweak and modify the game. Obviously, there's skill involved in knowing design and understanding how a certain change will affect the experience of play, but the sort of base level of accessibility is so much higher with an analog game.
Yeah, absolutely. I need to find something I say after people answer a question, because I feel like, yeah, absolutely sounds very disingenuous, but I'm just like, in my brain, it's just like, I need to get to the next thing. Don't take too long talking. One of the, what's the phrasing I'm looking for? There's a common theme among some artists. I'll be curious if you relate, that, find themselves going back to the same work over and over for inspiration. When Chuck Palahniuk was writing Fight Club, the rumor goes he was listening to the Downward Spiral on repeat. And when Trent Reznor was making the Downward Spiral, he supposedly had Taxi Driver on constantly in the studio. First, do you have any pieces of art that are just constantly on, that you were constantly getting inspiration from? And it's perhaps a more narrow question, what do you think your most rewatched movie is?
So I have two tonally very different answers to this. When it comes to your first question, what media am I like always kind of harkening back to? Well, there's a few things in terms of it, like not just what I'm listening to or watching, but like what is like genuinely what I see bleeding into my work. On the music side, I would say Fever Ray is a huge one. I don't know if you're familiar with them. So Fever Ray there's a band called The Knife, a Swedish brother-sister duo who make really weird and kind of intense electronic music. And one of them, Karen Dreyer, formed her own project. I think they're on project now, called The Knife, or sorry, not The Knife, called Fever Ray. And they put out an album under that name, and they've since put out a few more. And that first album in particular is probably my most listened to album. It definitely came out, and I think a lot of the stuff comes down to timing. Like it's a great album and everything, but it also came out at like just the right time for me. And it's pretty dark. A lot of it has to do with, honestly, it feels like postpartum depression. It's sort of this, you get this sense of like an isolated mother from this album, which I'm not and have never been, but I a lot of the feelings of like isolation and wandering the empty streets of your neighborhood, late at night or early in the morning, wondering what the fuck am I doing with my life, is very relatable, and certainly was to me at that time in particular. And so that album was very powerful for me. And interestingly, they put out that album and then didn't put out anything for a while. And then years later put out a second album that interestingly is very different. Is much more energetic, is much more it's not more intense, it's just a different kind of intense. And and it's a lot more about them sort of discovering a kind of queer identity. And it's a lot like hornier as an album. And that also came out at a really helpful time for me. And so because I was experiencing, again, like not the same thing, but something very like analogous to that, and having like a friend group and social world that was very outside of the mainstream, very queer, very, very different, while also dealing with a work situation that was like very oppressive and untenable for myself. So I'd say Fever Ray, more than any other single artist, has probably like helped me through many parts of my life. And also just like a lot of the atmosphere. These are albums that I can just like listen to on repeat, right? Like they can just keep going and going and going. And so I'm sure that they bleed into what I do quite a bit. On the second question, my most like rewatched movie. Well, actually, before I get to that, there's actually another piece, which is when it comes to inspiration and like what has directly inspired me. Sort of in between those two questions, there's the Ghost in the Shell franchise and world. And in particular, like I have the comics, I have other Shiro comics, like Appleseed and Dominion. There's a lot to criticize about him and his work, but I get so much out of them, and I can always go back to those comics and reread them. The movie, the original Ghost in the Shell film, is definitely one of my favorites. It's got such a like fascinating density to it. It has such an amazingly realized world, and it has such a like. So much of that movie is just shots of the city, without like any plot happening. It's just like you have this like incredibly dense, political intrigue and cyber psychosis and like all this crazy stuff happening. And then you have this like long, slow shot of like a boat moving down a canal, under all these signs. And I feel like tonally that movie is such an inspiration, because it hits so many. It has so much like very modern feeling, like alienation and paranoia and technology, but it also has this like interestingly slow appreciation for like an urban environment and kind of soaking in a space and a world. And then there's the TV show Standalone Complex, which is also in that world, which I also love for like kind of different reasons. And that show is like it has so much like fascinating and interesting exploration of kind of postmodern ideas and looking at the world and our technological world sort of through the lens of this like quasi dystopian, quasi utopian, like near future, and the way that like the problems that the characters are exploring in that space map to the problems that we experience in our own world. Like, it feels both so fantastical and also so plausible in so many ways, and it's just a fascinating exploration of all of those things. And so I feel like that universe, the sort of Ghost in the Shell universe, has had a huge inspiration on me. To finally get to your last question, my most watched movie, there is a through line, but it's, again, tonally very different. It's definitely Southland Tales. I don't know if you're familiar with this one.
Is that the one directed by the guy who did Donnie Darko?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
I love this movie. It is my favorite movie. It's not a perfect movie, but it is so fascinating. So yeah, the guy who made Donnie Darko, Richard Kelly, he made Donnie Darko, which I think launched like Jake Gyllenhaal's career pretty much. And was this like low budget movie that was a huge like cult hit. And so someone at some studio was like, oh, this guy is the next big director, right? Like he's gonna be, whatever he makes next is gonna be so big. So they're like, okay, we want you to make a movie, whatever movie you want. You're this like brilliant auteur. Here's like infinite budget to make it. We're not going to like give you any oversight, whatever. And he made this movie that like totally bombed. I mean, it did terribly in theaters, but it is such, I mean, it's a fun movie for one, but it's also like so of its moment and so bizarre. So it's this film that takes place in a dystopian future, dystopian future America, set in 2008, and it was released in 2007, I think. So, so that's already telling you something. And the cast is nuts. It's got Sarah Michelle Gellar. It's got The Rock. It's got, like, it's got, oh God, who else does it have? It has, the soundtrack is by Moby. It has Justin Timberlake. It's got John Lovitz. It's got like all these like comedians in like non-comedy roles exactly. It's so bizarre. It has like just like this cast where you're watching this movie and you're like, why is this person here? Um, uh, and yeah, and so it's this like dystopian future that is set like 1 year after the movie actually came out, and like there's this like power, this sort of utopian power source that is drawing energy from the ocean and using wireless energy to like power things. There's a nuclear bomb explodes in Abilene, Texas, that causes this like Republican kind of like takeover of the government, with this like very thinly veiled like Bush, like George W. Bush like analog. People need interstate travel visas. There's like all these crazy restrictions. There's this neo-Marxist underground like terror cell that is doing this like black market trade in human thumbs because you need like a thumbprint to vote. Like it's so crazy. You need to watch it like multiple times to even really understand what's happening. And I will say, there are two versions of the movie floating around. There's the theatrical release, and there's the Cannes cut that was shown at Cannes Film Festival. Both are fascinating, but the theatrical release is the one to watch. The Cannes cut is a little more comprehensible, but like not really in a good way. But it's the way I would describe it just as a thing is like it's a like liberal fever dream from like 2006, 2007. It's sort of the like the last gasp of the Bush era. And like I grew up, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. And so like a lot of my major developmental years were in the Bush era, in the George W. Bush like administration and the war on terror and all of that stuff. And so again, this is like a timing thing, right? Like with Fever Ray. This movie is such a like fascinating, very idiosyncratic encapsulation of that era. Right. And it came out right when it was like not relevant anymore. And but it's weirdly prescient also. Like it's despite how like absurd it is and weird and like silly, it's also sort of like, despite being too late for when it came out, it's also strangely ahead of its time in some ways. Fascinating movie, and it's one that I've seen probably too many times at this point.
This is not one of my questions. I guess it's a follow up. Have you seen Parks and Rec?
I actually have never watched it. No.
I think it's worth checking out, but I've been rewatching it recently, and I think it's it's similar in some ways, but I guess I'll get to my point because I'm realizing now the idea of the comparison is not going to make sense until I talk about it. Anyways, I feel like Parks and Rec is so of its time, and it's very like Obama era humor in terms of like, I mean, politics has certainly always been very important. It's just that I think the number of people for whom politics is like life and death has gotten a lot larger. So I think a lot of the show is about like, oh, hey, it doesn't really matter what ends up happening here. We're just gonna slug it out, and we're all gonna be decent Americans, and it's and I think it's a really funny show, but it is very of its time. It's like, because especially you watch it now, and there's like, there's all this like Ron Swanson, the very libertarian character, is all like slash the budget. It's like he's like advocating for job cuts and all these things. It's one of those things of like that hits a lot different nowadays. But I don't know. I think there is something like what did Ryan Johnson say about the Knives Out movie? Something like, you kind of have to make something that's very of its time in order for it to have any relevance later. And I think that is true. Like I think so many people are starting out with the goal of like, let's make something that's timeless, and then by doing that, it really ends up aging. You know what I mean? I find. But yeah, that's
what you think is timeless in a certain time period is so defined by that time period, right? Like, yeah, I think one of the things with Mothership that really drew me to it as an example is it has what they call a cassette futurist setting. And that's like, again, looking back at Alien, right? 1977, I think. It has the spaceship set, which is incredible and like still looks like futuristic in some ways, but it's so clearly from the 70s, right? Like you look at Star Wars, some of the best ever, spaceship design and setting design and, character design. But it's also like of its time, right? And Ghost in the Shell and uh, Blade Runner and anything cyberpunk really is like a 1980s vision of a dystopian future. It's really taking this era of like corporate ascendancy in the 1980s and playing it out into the future. Unfortunately, like a little too accurately, but all of these things are so informed by their particular time and place. And it is interesting. I mean, this kind of comes in cycles, I think, but you have these sort of trends, right, in storytelling or in genre fiction or whatever, that I think speak to certain anxieties of a particular era or a particular class or some combination thereof, and some of these things like ebb and wane for sure, but some of the things that we think of as timeless are just things that kind of can get recontextualized later, right? And so you can take something that feels very of a particular time and be like, oh, I can see myself in this. Maybe not even in the way that the original creators intended or could have ever imagined. But yeah, it is interesting that like, I feel like one of the most sort of surefire ways to arrive at a universal truth is through specificity, right? Like the specificity of a particular experience. It's like, that's what makes it feel real. And then even though it's so specific and so like, oh, I'm putting in a VHS tape and blah, 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 like all these signifiers of a particular era. There's something about that specificity that like, as a viewer, lets you like tap into whatever's underneath that.
So many pieces to touch on there. I think one of the ones that jumps to mind is I think I feel like it's starting to go away now, but during the 2010s, there was a trend in film that I found really annoying. And I think Nerdwriter made a video on this that was honestly kind of mid, but it was like 6 years ago, so whatever. But I like films never show like smartphones, or at least blockbusters like back in the day. It was because I feel like Hollywood thought things were progressing so fast that if they showed the thing then it would like, but I don't like that. Like, I think it's really like just goofy because I don't know. I feel like you should just make the most of what you have and just like full send it in the moment. And because I don't know, I think trying to imagine the reaction or trying to engineer how people will respond to something is kind of a fool's errand. And it's also, at least for me, I just don't feel it's the job of an artist. I think you have to, speak your own thing and then just see what happens. Because I mean, it's like what you said, and you touched on it in various incarnations earlier with Fever Ray and all that kind of thing. Certainly, that's been one of the really fun things about doing interviews, right? Is learning what people's motivations are, and how, like, someone, a hyperpop artist named Plasmic comes to mind. They have a song called oh gosh, I think it's Little Codependency or My Little Codependency, and I've never really experienced a relationship like that. Like, my only girlfriend was like when I was 15. She was super cool. I nothing negative to say about her, but it was just, I'm not a big relationship person. I'm very like focused on art and just my own worlds, but still I listen to that song and I'm just like, it just brings me a lot of images that are totally not what Plasmic had in mind. But, for me, it's like, who cares? And I think that's what you have to do as an artist, right? Like, just make the best version of, yourself, or what you can create, or the most intense version, or, whatever it is, whatever the adjective is for what you're trying to do. Because I think that's where the real juice comes from, at least that's the case in my experience. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell you what, I only have a few more for you here, and then I'll get you out of here in good time. But I think we touched on this earlier in the interview, and I think you mentioned wanting players to feel unsettled a little bit. I was watching Brennan Lee Mulligan talk about the process of DMing, and he said something to the effect of, you always want to make sure people are having a good time. I think he was talking about D&D or something. I can't remember the exact game he was talking about. When you're doing a horror TTRPG, Mothership or, whatever it may be, I guess the broad question is like, what do you want people to be feeling in the room? What do you want people to take away from it? Is it that like that horror movie sense of like, ooh, we were all spooked out and then we got it out of our system, or what is it that you're chasing after there?
Well, I think to some extent it is that like cathartic release, right? Of oh, we had this sort of spooky, intense experience, and we released it. We got it out of our system. I think that there is an element of that for sure. But I would say like there's a lot of in the last decade or so, there's been a lot more talk and interest, I think, in what is commonly termed like safety tools and safety in role-playing games, where you are entering this social situation, right? Where you're, whether it's on a video call or it's people at an actual physical table, it's a social setting, and people have different tolerances for different things, right? And with horror in particular, you're going to be dealing with stuff that people find disturbing, and that, like, in any game you're going to be dealing with that, right? Like with a fantasy setting, like what kind of brutality are players going to be encountering, right? Are we dealing with like a Game of Thrones kind of situation where you're dealing more frankly with murder and rape and like any number of horrible things, or are you dealing with a more Lord of the Rings, Tolkien-esque situation where there is still horrible stuff, but it's perhaps a little more off screen or a little more, limbed in some way. Or are you doing something more like Adventure Time where you could still have some heavy topics in there, but the way you're going to deal with them is very different. You're not depicting them the same way, right? And when it comes to horror, it's like, okay, you're kind of by default leaning into the more horrible stuff, right? You're much more likely to be dealing with people's bodies exploding and like visceral descriptions of gore and whatever, like depending on what the setting is, and and it's all stuff that can cause distress in people. And so I think in the more modern like tabletop games world, you have people coming up with tools like the X card or lines and veils or what have you, tools that are these sort of mechanical systems that you can bring to a table and say, okay, if something that's happening is making you uncomfortable, like raise this card, or if something is or before we start, like we have a discussion about what is on the table, what's off the table, right? And I think a lot of these tools are useful, but it's also important to recognize that like people have social skills, right? And part of running a game, part of participating in a game is navigating a social space. And there's not really a set of tools, like game mechanic-esque tools, that are going to solve that problem for you. It's always going to be to some degree, a question of empathy, right? Of looking at the people at the table with you and understanding, or trying to understand in an earnest way, where they're coming from, what they're looking to get out of the experience, and what they can handle, right? Because I think, like, people, there's an interesting thing in art and in creating things and in creating experiences and games, where your audience, especially with games, may be very opinionated. They may have a real sense of, this is what I want to get out of this experience. And that can be good in the sense that, as someone playing a game or as someone running a game, you can hear that from people and create something that they'll enjoy, knowing that that's what they want to get out of it. But at the same time, the most memorable, the most affecting experiences, I find, tend to be ones that aren't things that you already knew you wanted. If you already know, if the only experience that you're getting is the thing that you asked for specifically, there's no surprise there, right? There's no, you're not being pushed in any way. You're kind of sitting completely in the space that you've already predefined. And when it comes to, like, what makes a social experience with other people really rewarding, a huge part of that is connecting with people, but another part of it is getting pushed a little bit and having that setting push you to a place that's, like, a little bit uncomfortable, but the space is such that you can feel some degree of safety exploring that uncomfortable space. And you have your predefined area that you like being in. You know you like being in it. And you get pushed to the edge of that. And maybe by being pushed to the edge of it, you push that boundary out a little bit, right? And that's growth, right? That's a way of expanding your idea of what the world can offer you. And so you have people come to the table who are like, oh, I don't really like, I want to play this game because it sounds fun. My friends are doing it, whatever, but, like, I'm not interested in, the role play part of it, or the like being too invested in the character. And so you have people come to the table who are, and I've certainly been this person, right? Where you come to the table having ideas and being excited about it, but also having apprehensions, being like, there's an element of performance here that I am self-conscious about, that I don't want to do in front of other people. And so you get very, you either don't do it, or you get very jokey, and you kind of try and fuse any situation that has any kind of potential emotional weight or gravity as a kind of self-protective thing, because to allow that weight to happen, to allow that gravity, is vulnerable, right? And you feel like you're opening yourself up to other people. And so people don't want to feel scared. People don't want to feel frightened at a table, because they don't want to have this vulnerability with other people. If you can get people who know each other well, or who can kind of cultivate a relationship through play or some other scenario, you can wind up in a place where people trust each other enough that they can do their, their character voice, or their, or just, like, allow themselves to just respond honestly to something that is like distressing or disturbing, and or exciting, or titillating or whatever. Like, you can have any number of experiences, and players can respond to them in ways that are multifaceted and may look like distress. But if you have this relationship with them where you've developed some degree of understanding, you can kind of check in and with them and be like, okay, cool, like this was a crazy scene, let's take a quick break, check in with someone, be like, doing okay, like you good. And yeah, so there's a degree of like emotional intelligence that you need to cultivate, which among nerds can be hard to do, but it is worth it, right? And you can then use that to explore things that are uncomfortable, without being like, yeah, discomfort can be a feature, I guess is what I'm saying. It can be part of the point, and it can be part of the fun and the excitement. But yeah, it's a fine line to ride, and it's certainly something that you're going to approach differently at a convention game where you just have a bunch of randos coming to play one session versus a home game where you're playing over the course of 50, 100 sessions with the same people.
There are a million things I can touch on there, but I don't want to take too much of your time. There are two questions I ask everyone I interview, and I'll get you out of here on these. The penultimate question. This is the setup to the question. This is not the question itself. Are you familiar with the Voyager Golden Record?
I am, not intimately, but yes, I'm familiar with it.
If you were in the room, is there a song you would have added to the Golden Record?
Yeah, man, it's such a hard question. I guess it's like, really, it's like, how do you represent humanity to the universe, right? It's hard for me to not fall back to Fever Ray on this, just because I have such a personal connection to it. But yeah, I don't know. I think I always wonder about the like assumptions that go into a project like that, like the Golden Record, and to what extent people, or to what extent like other life in the universe would be anything like us. It's certainly something I've thought about in things like Mothership. The module that I put out actually doesn't even have aliens in it, right? Like it's all about people doing terrible stuff to other people. And are you familiar with the Three Body Problem books?
I know of it. I've not consumed them.
So there's a concept. It doesn't actually originate from these books. It's just a concept that the books use, of the dark forest, and it's a kind of pessimistic idea, but it's interesting as a kind of a contrast to like the Voyager Golden Record. It's this idea that you like that like different beings in the world, in the universe, are dangerous to each other, and we live in this dark forest, effectively, and in which we can't see anything else. We're just kind of existing out there, and and all of the creatures that live in this place are unaware of each other and don't see each other. And the odds are good that if you make yourself known, you're making yourself a target more than anything else. And so by broadcasting something about yourself or by announcing yourself, you are inviting destruction upon yourself. And it's so interesting that like that is it's just a very contrasting conception to sort of the mindset that went into the Voyager probe, and this sort of much more optimistic idea of like, hey, we're this intelligent species that understands math and creates art and does all these things. And I don't know, there's like some part of me that loves the idea of some Klingon-esque, alien species that sees everything as a threat, and intercepts the Voyager and listens to the record. And I don't even know what songs are on there, right? But they hear some jaunty human tune, and they're like, "Oh, this kind of slaps, actually. Like, maybe we should, get in touch with these people. They can't be all bad." And then they show up near Earth, and we all panic and like nuke them or something. Like, there's so many like weird and interesting and fascinating like ways to interpret like our seeming aloneness in the universe. None of which answers your question. Honestly, I don't know. I would love to have a great answer for this, but I feel like with this kind of thing, it's like, okay, how do you anticipate what kind of music aliens would like to hear when we know nothing? We know literally nothing about them, other than they can figure out, presumably, how to listen to music off of this golden record.
Yeah, you don't have to.
I really don't know.
That's okay. It's I think you answered the question even without answering. If it makes you feel any better, we certainly got to the heart of your truth, I think.
Sure.
Gosh, dude, I tell you, I got bronchitis like a year ago or something, and I don't even know if I still have it, but I tell you what, I keep having a cough, and I'm gonna go post on someone. I swear to God, parody. But the last one I asked, the thing I've asked every person I've interviewed, what kind of art do you think the world needs more of right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like we're obviously in a very like unstable place right now globally. And it's certainly a scary time. I know for me, for people who have, grown up around the same time as me, things have seemed to just have gotten worse and worse and worse as we've gotten older. And like nearly every major like political event or world event has been like some kind of catastrophe in living memory. And one thing I've found is there's a lot of like difficult, painful conceptions of the world, right? You have the term like doomerism, where you have this feeling that like we're fucked, right? Like we're doomed. And, you know, on an existential level, I mean, that's kind of true, right? Like we're all going to die. But that's always been true, right? And so what's the difference between like we're all going to die and we're doomed? And I feel like the big difference there is well, if you're doomed, yes, death is kind of the best thing you've got going for you, right? Like it's we're all screwed, everything's terrible, and it's sort of like we might as well all be dead. Um, and it doesn't. I don't think it has to be that way. I think um, you look at conceptions of the world, of possible futures, of, you know, science fiction stuff like that. You have the joke that has been floating around of you know, the headline like scientists proudly announced that they've built the torment nexus from the famed sci-fi book Don't Build the Torment Nexus, um, which is sort of what like the AI bro mindset feels like right now. Like we're building this thing while also making these press releases that this thing could destroy the world. And it's like, how much do you actually believe that versus how much is that like some kind of weird, like nihilistic hype machine? And you also have this thing of like, okay, you have all this sci-fi stuff, like all the things that you know, that we've been talking about, Ghost in the Shell and Blade Runner and all these things. And a lot of the time it feels like, man, people are really just taking the wrong lessons from this stuff. And like, we have this idea of, you know, like the flip phone coming from the tricorder from Star Trek, and these inspirations that sci-fi has created for people to actually implement. But then what they're building is like, so it might come from, you know, the book Don't Build the Torment Nexus. It might come from the thing that is clearly meant to be a dystopian future, um, or is at least exploring something that is a bit more like complex and nuanced. And then you like literally have Sam Altman, you know, releasing a new version of ChatGPT with a tweet that just says "her," referencing the movie, um, which is like, I don't know. You watch that, like, who watches that movie and thinks, yeah, this is the future I want to create, right? Like, it's I don't know. It's truly bizarre. And so when I think of like the art that we want to create, like, or that the world needs, I think is how you put it. Um, it's tough because I think that your the way a piece of art can influence the world is so unknowable, right? It's kind of like you said, you mentioned before, the kind of like death of the artist type thing, where you create something, or someone, you know, someone creates a song and you interview them and learn that their song is about whatever things. But when you listen to the song, you have an entirely different set of experiences in your mind. Um, and, you know, and similar for me and like Fever Ray, right? Like they're writing from this particular set of experiences that I don't have. And I can certainly relate to it in some ways based on my own experiences, on my own, you know, mental health struggles and whatever. But like, it's certainly not what they were talking about. And so, um, ultimately I wouldn't really prescribe like a particular kind of art. I think really, I think the stuff that is most important is like whatever can foster connections between people and imagine worlds that we actually do want to live in. I think there is place for dystopian fiction. I think there is place for horror and all this stuff. But like, I think there is also a need for art that creates like that does create community, that creates some kind of, or doesn't create community. I don't think art can really create community, but like that can be used to create community, that can be used to foster some kind of connection between people, whether that's between an artist and their audience, or between just disparate people, and help them like honestly get excited about something, right? Because I don't really know what the antidote is to sort of existential doom and gloom, but I do think that if, as kind of a counterpoint to the current state of, you know, billionaire rocket ships and stuff, the first space shuttle that NASA built was called the Enterprise because of Star Trek, right? Like it, and a lot of the people that worked on it because of Star Trek. And you know, I think there's certainly arguments to be had about like what is the utility of space flight and going to the moon and all this stuff, but like one thing I do respect about Star Trek is it, even though it's kind of corny and maybe, you know, people today would call it cringe in some ways, like it has a vision of a future that dares to imagine, you know, an end to racism, an end to capitalism, an end to any number of sort of social ills, and kind of asks the question like, what if those weren't problems anymore? What if we solved those problems and we could focus our energies on a new set of way cooler problems? You know, how do you communicate with a non-physical being made of pure energy? Like that rules, you know, like how do I'd much rather think about that than think about like how to implement a progressive tax structure in my state, right? So yeah, I think in a sort of characteristically roundabout way for this interview, I would say like if art gets people excited, I think that's a win. If it gets them excited to connect with people and to do to make the world a more equitable and livable and honestly exciting and fun place, then I think that's the art we need. And I'm not going to presume to know what that looks like necessarily, but because I think that can be a lot of different things. But I guess, okay, the last thing I'll say before I stop this whole ramble is I also hope that people can. So one thing I see a lot of nowadays is like hesitancy and self-censorship. And people are afraid to, to say certain words, right? Like people, making TikToks or whatever, there's a whole vocabulary of like alternate words for things that could get you demonetized or get you, the algorithm to not show you to people or whatever. And so there's this whole alternate vocabulary with words like unalive and whatever, where, and then there's also the kind of social situation of people being afraid to do something that is cringe or whatever. And I think like, that's a trap, right? I think both of those things are traps. And the more that you internalize either of those, the more fucked you are, because you have this like, if you can't get what's really going on inside you out, it's gonna eat you alive. And I think so much of the sort of surveillance state that we've created, and so much of the algorithmic world we live in, has encouraged people to really limit their views on what they can create and share with the world. And ultimately, I think like finding something you're excited about and doing it and sharing it with the world, maybe before you think it's really ready to be shared with the world, or before it's like fully safe to be shared with the world, is really important. I think we have, there are so many voices out there that might be too afraid to talk, and I'd like to hear them. So I think that's it for me.